Hey friends, I hope your week is off to a great start. Today I'm going to be trying out Rick Martinez's recipe for Butter Pecan Skillet Cookies from the December issue of Bon Appetit. So I'm really excited to try this recipe out because I've never made cookies in a cast iron skillet before. And what I like about this general idea is that it seems a little bit less fussy than making a bunch of individual cookies, and the end result visual aesthetic is just completely different from all of the other generally round cookies that you're going to see this holiday season. So I do these Bon Appetit recipe tests every single Wednesday. If you like this one, please be sure to give me a big thumbs up and click subscribe. Without any further ado, let's get into this recipe. So the first thing that we need to do is chop up our pecans so that we can candy them. So I've got my whole pecans here and I'm just going to coarsely chop these. And some of these pecans are going to go on top of the cookie, and some of the pecans are going to be ground up into the dough for the cookie. So you want to be mindful as you're chopping that you want them to be large enough that they'll still look nice and pretty on the top of your cookie. So don't get too carried away here. So these look nice and coarsely chopped here. So these are going to look great on the top of a cookie. And to these chopped pecans, I'm going to add some kosher salt, as well as some maple syrup. And I'm just going to give these a quick toss to make sure they're all evenly coated in syrup. So we'll go onto a baking tray here lined with parchment paper. Lining with parchment paper is a great idea here because this syrup is going to get super sticky. So do yourself a cleanup favor and line your baking tray with either parchment or a sill pad if you have it. And we want these in a single layer, so I'm just spreading them out so they all get evenly toasty and crispy. So I'm going to pop these into the preheated 350-degree oven for 15 to 20 minutes until the nuts are starting to darken up and the syrup is looking all bubbly and thick. Alright, and so these pecans have been in the oven for 15 minutes. You can see that they're looking really gooey. This maple syrup is nice and bubbly. The recipe says to retoss the pecans just to get everything evenly coated in the syrup again. So I'm doing just a quick shuffle around. The syrup is definitely extremely dark, but it doesn't smell burnt at all. So that is a positive sign. So I'm going to let these hang out at room temperature for about 30 minutes until that maple syrup gets nice and crispy and we can break this up and move on to the next step. So the candy pecans are just about done cooling, which means it's time to move on to prepping the dough. So first up, I've got my 10-inch cast iron skillet, and we need to butter this and line it with parchment. And whenever I'm lining a pan with parchment paper, I like to fold the parchment over on itself multiple times back and forth until I get kind of a skinny little pie piece. That way I can place that approximately in the center and kind of eyeball the size that I need to cut this to. Cool. All right, so I like how that looks. And the recipe says to generously butter the cast iron skillet, so I've got a tablespoon of cold butter here. I'm going to run this all around the pan, and we're buttering the bottom of the pan. We're going to put the parchment in and then butter the parchment paper too. So this should be a no-stick situation by the time we're done with it. All right, and that looks super buttered to me. So here I've got the candied pecans. These are fully cooled, and you can see they're lifting off in nice crispy pieces. This is looking and smelling incredible. So basically what we need to do is just break this up and divide it in two. If you see any little burnt bits, you can go ahead and throw those away. So I'm just going to eyeball it. We'll take this first half, and I'm going to pop this into my blender jug along with my all-purpose flour. And then the second half here, I'm going to just pop into a little bowl, and we're going to save this for later. So already in, I've got my AP flour. We've now got half of our prepared pecans. I've got some kosher salt here, some light brown sugar, and basically we're looking to just pulse this until the nuts are all chopped up and kind of evenly incorporated. So since the recipe wanted us to do this entire thing in the food processor, I'm improvising a little bit here. So I've got my dry ingredients, these are ready to go. So I'm going to dump this into a mixing bowl. And the recipe wanted us to pulse cold butter through the dry ingredients and then add the egg and vanilla. Pulsing this in a blender would not work the same way as pulsing in a food processor. So I've got my pastry cutter here, and I'm just going to cut this butter into the flour mixture here. The recipe said to use a food processor probably for a specific reason. It also said to use cold butter for a specific reason. So I don't think that you'd want to try to use your stand mixer. I don't think you'd want to cream this butter. I think that's going to give you a very different end result. What I'm doing here is probably the closest you're going to be able to do if you don't have a food processor. And I'm going to add in my whole large egg. Probably the most vanilla I've ever put into a recipe before. So I'm just using my dinner knife and I'm going to swirl this around, just trying to get everything evenly spread throughout. So this to me is looking like a nice kind of normal cookie dough. It's a little bit wet looking. And since my dough has already come together in the mixing bowl, I don't need to use my hands to knead it. It is definitely fully incorporated. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn this out into my prepared cast iron skillet. And the recipe said to use damp hands to press this. So this is a very sticky dough, as I said. The damp hands are definitely helping me spread this out. And you wanna get this all the way to the edges. We're not trying to make a crust or anything. We're looking for an even layer. So I'm going to pop this into the preheated 325-degree oven for 30 to 35 minutes until it's getting golden brown around the edges and the center is a little bit puffy. And so this cookie was in the oven for a total of 35 minutes. You can see that right around the edges it is starting to get brown. It's a little bit puffy here in the center, and it's starting to pull away from the edge of the pan just ever so slightly. So we've got to let this cool in the skillet for a minimum of 1 hour before we attempt to remove it. So I'm going to let this cool down to room temp, and then we'll come back with the next step. So the cookie skillet has been cooling for 1 hour, and it is now cool to the touch. So I need to flip this out onto a cutting board. All right, nice and easy release. Peel off the parchment paper. This did a great job not sticking, and I'm super impressed. Now we need to cut this into 16 pieces. So I'm going to just use my pizza cutter here, I think. Yeah, I think using a large knife actually works a little bit better than using the pizza wheel, at least for cutting these smaller slices. Now I'm transferring these onto a wire rack set inside of a rimmed baking sheet. I'm putting these right side up. This will be kind of the staging area for decorating them. So with the cookies all sliced, we can go ahead and build the glaze to finish decorating these cookies. So in a medium bowl, I've got some icing sugar. To that, I'm going to add 3 tablespoons, maybe a little bit more whole milk. The same basic idea as what we used on the tie-dye cookies. I'm gonna add a little kosher salt, whisk this together. Add in my vanilla extract. And the recipe says we want this to be the consistency of heavy cream. Okay, and I think that's good there. So we're doing this in 2 separate bowls because by the time we reach the halfway point, apparently this will be full of crumbs and we'll want to start all over. So using 2 separate bowls so that we can have a crumb-free coating. And then I'm lightly touching this cookie into the surface of the glaze, letting any of the drips kind of come off. So we don't have a perfect glaze coating. I'm going to spread it around, try to get nice full coverage. And then I'm going to sprinkle on some of these pecans. I'm trying to get a good mix of kind of nut fragments as well as half or quarter pecan pieces visible on the top of the cookie. I think it's a nice kind of flavor cue to let people know what to expect, and having large nut pieces shows that you bought, you know, the good quality nuts rather than like the scraps that were in the bag. It shows that you had the big nut pieces to start with. I think it just looks a little bit nicer. And as BA predicted, my first batch of glaze is filled with crumbs. So I'm ready to scoot onto my fresh glaze as I cross the halfway point with my decorating. And the recipe says to wait 10 minutes before putting the sparkling sugars onto the cookies. So it hasn't been exactly 10 minutes since I started the first batch of cookies, but I think it's been long enough to where I can go back and start adding the sugar. I'm also going to add the sugar immediately to the second half of the cookies. That way we can see, does it really make a difference? Do you have to wait, or can you just go crazy? And I've got a white kind of coarse sparkling sugar. Then I've got this gold shimmering sugar that I think might look nice as well, so I'm just going to sprinkle some of those on. The recipe said if you have edible glitter that you could use that. With the cookies all decorated, I'm just going to let these sit at room temperature for about 30 minutes to let that glaze firm up, and then we'll give these a taste. So this is the finished product here. You can see that all of the toppings are thoroughly adhered to the cookie. I can still see the visible presence of both the white sparkling sugar and the coarser gold sugar on there. The large pieces of pecans are holding tight, so overall this looks really, really great, and the smell is fantastic. So let's see how it tastes. The nuts are so crunchy. The cookie itself, super, super tender, very crumbly, but not in like a dry, over-baked way. Wow. This is really good. So the taste on these is fantastic. The texture is a little bit on that dry and crumbly side. That could be due to my slightly over baking, or maybe it's just the way that the recipe is, or maybe it's that I made it in a blender rather than a food processor. That said, I do think that the flavor and texture on these is very nice. Appearance-wise, I love this. I think it's super cool. I've never seen a cookie like this before, so this is a really kind of wow moment. And I like that it's different from a normal cookie. This is definitely something that if I saw this at a cookie swap, I'd say, what's that? I want to have one. My initial hypothesis that this would be less fussy than making individual cookies, totally wrong. I mean, you're decorating each one of these individually, so it's the same exact thing. Overall, this is definitely a win, and I would recommend that you give it a try. So I really hope you enjoyed this week's video. If you did, please be sure to give me a big thumbs up and click subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week.